Hello and welcome back to the Piskie Trap, a series where we explore the folklore, history and legends from across Devon and Cornwall. Hope you're all keeping well and having a lovely week. As usual, a big thank you to all the patrons and to all of you who've been listening and supporting the series so far. If you've been enjoying it, then don't forget to give us a like and subscribe, spread the word among your friends to help this project grow even further. If you're able, you might consider checking out my Patreon page at patreon.com/The Piskie Trap. For those of you perhaps not familiar with it, Patreon is basically a subscription service where you can opt to give a monthly donation to help support creative projects like this one. I try and set the tiers as low as I can, so there's options there starting from £1 a month. And essentially, donations there help me to buy books and source research materials and just cover the running costs so that I can keep bringing you new Piskie Trap content. A massive thank you to everyone who's been in touch regarding the talks on witchcraft in Cornwall, which are coming up in May. The tickets for the event on the 15th of May at the Royal Cornwall Museum have now sold out, which is amazing. So thank you for everyone who's booked so far. But for those of you who are interested, I'll also be at the Polly in Falmouth on the 12th of June and into Bodmin at the Old Library on the 7th of June. So I'll pop links to both those events in the show notes. Right, that's all the business side of things done. Let's crack on with the episode. I mentioned last time that I would be bringing you a bit of a case update following on from the Piskie Bite, where we looked at this idea of ill-wishing and some examples from Mid Cornwall. So, first off, I want to say a big thank you to those of you who got in touch in response to that episode. Firstly, to Joe Tagney, who got in touch with some more information relating to Jenny Broad, or Ginny Broad as she seems to have been known locally. It appears that Joe used to live in a house which was said to have been where Ginny once lived. It's in Treesmill, which is a little hamlet down the hill from Towerdreth, in a little valley essentially between Towerdreth and Lenescott, and it's close to the marsh. Some of you may remember that Ginny had been regarded locally as a witch back in the 1840s. And according to the newspapers of the time, there had been uproar around Towerdreth after a miner had been brought back from the mine on a stretcher, dead, having allegedly been ill-wished by Ginny. Apparently, there are some local stories and rumours that this miner was in fact Ginny's husband, and there are also tales of her having pet toads that were regarded as sort of familiars. It all seems to tie in with a lot of common superstitions and stereotypes surrounding witchcraft at that time. What's really interesting is the proximity of Treesmill to that marsh nearby. There's a thought locally that at one time when the nearby Foy Consols mine was active and the engines were running, the marsh dried up for a time, and once the mine had closed and the pumps ceased, the marsh was flooded once more. I'm told that back in 1991, the local community and students from nearby Towerdreth School actually put on a play where they told a story of the toads from the marsh coming to visit Ginny Broad, asking her to use her powers to stop the mine engines so that their habitat would be restored. This Ginny did, for the engines soon stopped, and the toads happily returned to their homes. I love that. I love this idea of a play incorporating her and the local wildlife and the landscape, and I wish I'd been there to see it. So thank you to Joe for getting in touch with that information. Secondly, I'd also like to say a big thank you to Dr. Rupert White, who heard the episode on ill-wishing and was kind enough to send me a copy of his fantastic book entitled Ill-Wished: Witchcraft and Magic in 19th Century Cornwall, which I highly recommend if you're interested in the subject. Rupert is also the editor of the Inquiring Eye, Journal of the Museum of Witchcraft and Magic. As soon as I'd received a copy of Ill Wished, I immediately began having a read-through, and lo and behold, in there was an article in the West Briton which I hadn't encountered before, dated the 3rd of December 1841, which bears the title Witchcraft in the 19th Century. And though it doesn't mention her by name, it seems to be in relation to Ginny Broad. It appears to tie in with many of the details given in Prynne's account of the case in Tower Dreth, but puts a very different slant on it. So I'll go through the article in full, which reads as follows. A village not 100 miles from Tower Dreth has been aroused from its wonted peaceful state by a fracas connected with a witching case. It appears that for some time past, several persons who have been ill have attributed their misfortune to a certain female who is a reputed witch. Her influence, or ill will, was dreaded by the neighbours, and many a tale is told of persons actually dying through her incantations. One person in particular had been ill for some time, who, hearing that a witch-finder who lived not 100 miles from Mevagissey was about to visit a neighbouring village in order to inspect a case of supposed evil influence, took advantage of the opportunity, and the wise man was duly invited to his dwelling. Upon the arrival of the seer on Sunday the 21st ultimo, he ultimately pronounced the case to be one of decided witchcraft, and not only so, but casting his eyes across the road, exclaimed, "There is the woman who has bewitched you," and proceeded to speak, challenging her as being a witch and the author of the evil which the patient suffered. Upon this, the woman flew at him, and a desperate conflict ensued, when it is supposed that the woman inflicted a slight wound on her throat, in order to charge the seer with attempting her life. The case of assault and battery was a subject for investigation by the powers above them on the coming Monday, when persons hesitated not to charge her with practising witchery for some time, to the injury of life and limb. One of the witnesses, it appeared, had attended on the woman some months since, when ill, when she declared, as she wished to die easy, the way and manner of her initiation into the mystery of witchcraft, which was by attending the sacrament and repeating the Lord's Prayer thrice backwards, partaking of the wine, but securing the bread and giving it to a toad, which according to the prediction of her instructress she found on her way home, and took with her and retained as the magic power of her spell. Whether she has resigned this personification of the demon of the black art, we have not been informed. But we should suppose that the good folks of that enlightened locality would not be satisfied with such a formidable monster existing among them in all its malignant potency. From her confession, however, it appeared that she, at that time, would fain yield up her power. But with the return of health, the witching was not laid aside, thus bearing out the old ditty, "When the devil was ill, the devil a monk would be, but when the devil got well, the devil a monk was he." Evidence was gone into of her being in the constant habit of using violent language towards persons, and otherwise rendering herself generally obnoxious. And on this count, for upon a charge of witchery who would convict, she was held to bail to keep the peace for 2 years. The sick man, in the meantime, recovered, but strong fears are entertained that although debarred from using ill language, she may exercise the power which she possesses for mischief in a silent manner, to the further injury of her Majesty's subjects in that district. It is strange that when once the person has the reputation of being a witch, prejudice is so strong that it is with great difficulty one convert to reason can be gained from amongst those who are prejudiced. Much has been said of the march of intellect, but there are many places where her sway is considered as of secondary importance in comparison with the fostering of that bane of all that is great and good, superstition. Let the notion of witchcraft be but encouraged, and persons will not be wanting to take advantage of the unreasonable belief, either for the purpose of making themselves feared, or for private advantage. Where is the schoolmaster? Wow, so a few things to talk about there. There's no doubt in my mind that this case is referring to Ginny Broad and comes from the village of Tywardreath itself, not least because the events tie in with the accounts kept by Prynne. That said, this article takes a very different approach. Whereas Prynne comes across as sceptical about local beliefs and superstitions surrounding witchcraft and claims to have known Ginny personally, kind of defends her as well, and is quite scathing of the white wizard who comes over from Mevagissey. In the West Briton, she's portrayed as, well, in their words, a monster, a local nuisance, depicted as this stereotypical witch dabbling in the black arts who has a toad as a familiar. And I have to wonder whether this article was the source of these rumours about Ginny and the toads, or whether that was inspired by pre-existing local gossip. It's an odd article to read because there's a lot of dramatisation in there. That fight between the two of them, for example. They seem to relish in the local stories about her and the profanation of the Blessed Sacrament, as Prynne once wrote about it. And then at the end, they get typically Victorian and preachy about the March of Progress and the need to stamp out these local superstitions. So it's an odd mix. One thing that comes across to me in both this article and in Prynne's account is a sense of neighbourly disputes, conflict within the community, and a lot of it's centred around what appears to be a genuine fear and superstition surrounding witchcraft and the idea of ill-wishing at this time in the early 1840s. Thanks again to Rupert White for sending me that book, as it was brilliant to find another account of those events in Tywardreath, and it'd be great to hear what you guys think as well. If you have any other thoughts surrounding the story of Ginny Broad, or you found out any more, then feel free to get in touch. Now, initially, that was going to be it for this episode. Just a quick Piskie Bite case update. But then I got chatting with Francis Edwards, Cornish historian, writer, blogger and researcher, and we got talking about a subject that seemed to align quite well. Francis introduced me to a character by the name of Beatrice Small, who seems to have operated as a fortune teller in the areas around South and West Devon and in East Cornwall at the end of the 19th century and turn of the 20th century. There seems to have been a real crossover of beliefs when it comes to fortune-telling and ill-wishing, along with charms as well, and concepts that some might lump together with this notion of witchcraft and cunning folk. Her story seems to highlight the prevalence, particularly in rural areas, of the belief in fortune-telling and divination, scrying, that kind of thing. And Beatrice, it seems, played into that, travelling around, offering to tell people their fortune, and committing fraud on multiple occasions. So, without further ado, let's take a look at the story of Beatrice Small. on the first appearance of the new moon. Charm the moon by standing over the spears of a gate or stile and say, "All hail to the moon, all hail to thee. I prithee, good moon, reveal to me this night to whom my husband be." A ceremonial charm there on how to foresee your future spouse, taken from the pages of The Universal Fortune Teller, published in 1814, and found among the papers of Richard Palmer from Heddon Farm at North Tamerton, near the Tamar border, and recounted in Alex Langstone's From Granite to Sea. There seems to have been a long-held series of traditions and customs around the idea of divination and trying to foretell the future. A number of the ones that I've come across so far do seem to be aimed at foretelling a future spouse. Some divination beliefs and practices from the Polperro area are documented in Alex Langstone's work and Jonathan Couch's History of Polperro, where, and I quote, "Midsummer customs around the district included getting up early on Midsummer's Day to go foraging in the woods for the rarities of even-leaved ash and four-leaved clovers. If found, a rhyme would be recited. Even-leaved ash or four-leaved clover, you'll meet your true love before the day is over." Other Polperro charms for finding your true love at midsummer were to set a glass of water and, having broken an egg and separated the white from the yolk, throw the former into the glass and place it in the sunshine. You will soon see the ropes and yards of a vessel if your lover is to be a sailor, or a plough and horses if to be a farmer. This scrying technique seems to be unique to this area. If you borrow a wedding ring and suspend it steadily in a tall wine glass with a hair from your own head, think of your sweetheart, and if the ring strikes the side of the glass, your lover is to be found. End quote. So, a couple of old customs there for foretelling future spouses. What seems to have been a more general form of divination and a very old tradition comes from Thomas Quiller Couch, who writes of an old custom from over near Bodmin. A mile or so above Scarlet's Well, in the Fairwash Coombe, is the clear and perennial fountain, still giving its name to the field in which it is situated. The well is not now, if it ever was, enclosed by any masonry, but the limpid stream runs into a granite trough, the overflow irrigating the grass below. It had great repute among the dead and gone of Bodmin. Still, the aged retain some remembrance of it, and tell me how in their youth they used to frequent the holy well to divine their future by rushes from the marsh below, tied crosswise, with a now forgotten verse put to float on the water. So, we've established that there were certain old traditions and customs around the idea of divination and telling the future. And while in some areas this seems to have been fading away, even Quiller Couch talks about the practices starting to disappear. In rural areas, superstition surrounding charms and fortune-telling was still quite widespread in the latter half of the 1800s. And it was during this period that a woman named Beatrice Small seems to have been travelling around, often knocking on people's doors and offering to tell their fortune in return for payment or in exchange for clothing, food and the like. Beatrice appears to have been born Beatrice Glyde in Totnes in 1864 and married a Robert Gully Small in 1880. A lot of what we know about her comes from the fact that she appeared in court. Quite often, in fact. A few days ago, I chatted with Francis Edwards, who has written a blog post entitled The Notorious Beatrice Small, Fortune Teller, and we talked about some of the beliefs, customs and superstitions from around that time, and how all this fitted in with the story of Beatrice and her escapades across Devon and Cornwall. The moment you kind of talked about Beatrice Small, I realised that there was some similarities and some crossovers in terms of the superstition and the customs there. And so I wasn't aware of Beatrice Small, and so I was like, oh, this sounds up my street, and it's a great. It sounds like a good kind of case in point of beliefs and ideas at that time. Even it doesn't seem like that long ago.
It's not long ago at all. I mean, I'm imagine you've read Margaret Courtney's work.
Yeah.
Cornish Feasts and Folklore, and she talks in there that when she was growing up, I mean, she lived in Penzance, I think, all her life, and she says in a book that that in the countryside and in rural areas in Cornwall, people there, farmers, villagers, what have you, had a great fear of being ill-wished or ill-used. I think it was a hangover of an ancient belief system, really, that the kind of predates the Protestant Reformation, and it's a kind of a hangover from Catholic superstition, miracle workings, amulets, charms, that kind of thing. I mean, you read Keith Thomas, Religion and the Decline of Magic. It's one of the very first, along with E.P. Thompson, it's one of the very first kind of social histories, if you like. And it's a brick of a book. It's huge, but in the pre-computer age, as a kind of a piece of pure research. I mean, he must have gone to hundreds of archives and read hundreds of journal articles, and it's a phenomenal piece of work. It really is. But he analyzes how after the Protestant Reformation in rural areas in England. And I mean, he focuses on certain areas because that's where he was based. Obviously, he kind of showed how, despite the Reformation and despite the official religion in the UK at the time, these kind of old belief systems lingered on, and they lingered on for centuries. And ill wishing and fortune telling, white witches, and all those kind of charms and all those kind of systems pervaded. And Margaret Courtney's work touches on that. I mean, I can read an example now. So I've got the book here open. Let me see. Superstitions die hard. A horse died the other day on a farm in the neighbourhood of St Ives. His carcass was dragged on a Sunday away up to the granite rock basins and weather-worn bosses of Tregoban Hill, and there burnt, in order to drive away the evil spell or ill wishing which afflicted the farm where the animal belonged. And she's got pages and pages of these anecdotes that people still that people thought that would help them. And I suppose that in those days when there was no NHS, obviously there illnesses, spreading of germs, eating rotten food, accidents, injuries. There's no surgeries, no surgeons, anything like that. Any piece of ill luck, anything like that had to be explained in some way. And this kind of worldview of causation related back to magic. And of course, if your horse is ill, if your cattle are sick, if your crops have failed, well, how did that happen? What have I done that this ill fortune has become of me? Courtney says that in West Cornwall, people would travel as far as Exeter. In the pre-railway days, that they would walk or take a car as far as Exeter to go and see a Pella or a white witch, to have this supposed ill wish removed. And the methods used, there would be rings in glasses, bags of salt. They would have to carry special branches around with them and leave them under their pillow at night, and all these to our eyes and ears completely bizarre and obviously fake methods of removing these spells were employed, but of course they're also psychosomatic as well. If you're in this belief system, then you obviously believe that going to see a Pella will help you. And if you go and see them, you make all this effort, you probably pay them some money as well, or you give them some kind of tribute in kind. And then you travel all the way back from Exeter with this amulet or this spell or one of their rings out there, and you're almost forced to believe that it's going to work. And you get all the way back and you discover that, because most illnesses and injuries kind of clear up by themselves anyway, that after a while things get better, you know, the crops rise again and everything like that. So it's a kind of a self perpetuating way of thinking. And the authorities hated it. They believed that these people weren't buying into the industrial revolution. They weren't buying into science. They weren't buying into the Anglican Church. All these improvements that had been laid at their door, you know, the British Empire, all that kind of thing, was being ignored because they believed that a man in Exeter who would give them an amulet would help, you know, cure them of the hives or anything like that. I mean, there was at one of Beatrice Small's trials. She got 6 months hard labour, which is what she usually got when she was caught. The judge, in summing up, turned to the person who she had actually conned out of money because she said that they'd been ill wished. He said that those people who encouraged such things as these deserved an equal term of imprisonment. He believed that they were as much to blame as the activities of Beatrice Small herself. But it's an odd thing. I mean, people would travel to see a white witch. I mean, there was Thomasine Blight in Houston, of course, and hundreds of people came to see her. I mean, you know, people would travel for miles, but Beatrice Small operated in the opposite way. She went to people who didn't know or thought that they were in trouble or had been ill-wished, and told them that they'd been ill-wished, in the hope that they were gullible, credulous, foolish, whatever, and that she would be able to, inverted commas, help them out. And that's how she operated. I mean, she was prolific, I think, in southeast Cornwall, southwest Devon in the 1890s and early 1900s, and that's how she operated. She needed a remote area, no fixed abode. I mean, she's often found living in a tent somewhere in a field with her family, and she needed, you know, remote villages. I mean, she was in Lanreath, St Stephen's by Salt Ash, Aveton, Gifford, St Mary Church, Quithiot, Longdown, all these way out the way places, where there were less witnesses, small farms, servants, farmers' wives, people that she could get on their own, if you like, and kind of give them the whole spiel, the whole, you know, fortune teller patter with her feather in her hat and her massive shawl and her cards and her various charms. And she would use flattery. She would say that they always had like a lucky face. That was her usual opener. You know, I think you have a lucky face, my dear. But at the same time, the cards tell me that you've been ill-wished by someone, and if you give me some money, I'll be back in a few days. I can investigate it and I can come back and tell you who's been ill wishing you, and I'll give you a spell to remove the ill wish. And she would be paid. She would vanish for a couple of days, probably to give the person who she was conning, you know, time for their imagination to work and for them to get themselves even more worked up and worried. And then she would be back. Oh, it's this, and this. You need to do. And I think she gave one of her victims 3 envelopes in which she said contained photographs of the people who'd been ill wishing her. And of course, there was nothing in the envelopes at all. It was later found out, and she read from a book it was supposedly a book, but it actually was her actual hawker's license, that she was just holding a piece of paper to give the impression that she was reading from some parchment. And she had to play, and the victim had to place a ring on these 3 envelopes, and then put the ring under the pillow for 2 hours, and then they were allowed to open the envelopes, and then they would know who had been ill wishing them, and then Beatrice Small would miraculously return, and she would cast a spell, and everything would be rosy again. Of course, once Beatrice Small had recognised that she'd exhausted as much money, chickens, clothes as she could from whoever she was conning, she'd be gone. And in the Cornish and South Devon countryside, that was a pretty easy thing to do. And she was prolific. She really was. And of course, we only really know about the instances where she was caught because they were reported in the newspapers. I mean, we don't know of how many people she successfully conned who never knew that she was actually lying to them, who never knew that she'd taken their money under false pretenses, who probably wandered around for years with charms and amulets that they paid Beatrice Small to give them, believing that this was like warding off evil spirits. But of course, it was all hokum. And I mean, there must have been other people as well who she'd taken in and who had actually realised that they'd been taken in, but were so embarrassed by what had happened to them that they never went to the authorities either. I mean, there was one guy, I forget the village it was in, but he was called Mr. Masters, and Beatrice Small made Mr. and Mrs. Masters wear a cloth bag full of salt in their undergarments for several days to ward off this ill wish. And of course, Masters one day went to see Small in her tent in the field where she was currently residing, and she'd vanished. And it was at that moment that Masters realised that he'd been duped, and he swallowed his pride. He went to the authorities. Beatrice Small was caught because by then she was quite notorious. Everyone knew who she was in the courts of the time. And the case went to trial, and Masters had to stand there in the dock and explain to everybody watching that he'd been wearing a bag of salt in his undergarments for several days. And he must have, I mean, the audience laughed in the public gallery. He must have been the butt of many jokes in his village for ages to come. But it just made me think that story, that how many people thought, I just can't go through with that. Okay, she's had a few chickens, she's had a few shillings, but I really can't live with the shame of going to court and admitting to the people who know me and who live near me what an absolute fool I must have been. But she relied on that. She relied on that level of shame. She relied on that credulity, and it was a two-way thing as well. I mean, if no one ever believed in fortune tellers or in charms or in spells, then she would have had to have found another, probably equally immoral way of making a living. But no, yeah, I mean, an absolutely fascinating character. She really was. I think she must have had a real presence, but she always needed the countryside in which to operate. And I think she lived in Plymouth for about 2 years in the early 1900s, and there's no instances of her being reported for fortune telling in Plymouth at all. I mean, she was arrested for being drunk and disorderly, for fighting in a pub, for attempting to jump off a pier, and just general bad behavior, but never for fortune telling. I mean, mainly because maybe she had a fixed address. People knew where she lived, who she was. She couldn't move around as easily. She was easily identifiable. And of course, there's more people, more law and order, more witnesses. So she was probably never happy in Plymouth because she couldn't work her will on people, as it were. Where I think in the countryside, she must have been very persistent. I mean, she must have gone from village to village, house to house, cottage to cottage, for around and around for years at a stretch. I mean, a lot of people would have gone to the back door, and she would have been there with her cards and her charms, and they would have probably have crossed their arms and grinned to themselves and let her go through her whole patter and laughed and applauded, and well played, well done, here's a penny, now on your way, type of thing. But every now and then, and she would have known this, sooner or later she would have knocked on a door, the servant would have come to the door. You've got a lucky face, my dear. And this person would have been taken in, and that's when she moved in, as if you like. It was it was how to use a kind of romanticized. It's been romanticized quite a bit, a romanticized belief system for completely material gain. That's what I found so fascinating, how she would, play on the heartstrings of these poor people, and they were literally poor. They had nothing, and but she knew what she was doing, and yeah, I don't think she was a person to be taken lightly at all.
It looks as though Beatrice was by no means the only example of wandering fortune tellers roaming the countryside in the 19th century, or brought up on charges of fraud in relation to it. I've found a couple of examples in the Royal Cornwall Gazette. The first dates from 1860 and reads as follows: Fortune telling. Elizabeth Williams, 22, charged with stealing a sovereign from Maria French at Padstow on the 14th of September. Maria French, the prosecutrix, deposed, I live at Padstow. On the 13th of September, the prisoner came to my house and said she would tell my fortune. I said I was too old for that. She then said, I suppose you would not like your husband to be brought home to you a cripple and a bed liar. She also said, you have not enjoyed good health of late, have you? And I said, no, I have not. She said, there is a person who has got power over you. You are ill-wished. I gave her threepence that day. So we can see already there how the theme of ill-wishing gets interwoven as well. A second example comes from near St Austell and dates from the 18th of February 1881. Police court, Wednesday. Before Mr Arthur Code, an old woman named Bessie Foster, aged 70, was charged with endeavouring to extort money from a domestic servant in the employ of Mr Parsons of Lower Trebiddle, St Austell, by pretending to tell the girl's fortune. For informing this very credulous servant that she would be married to a Frenchman with lots of money, the old woman, a short time since, received 1 shilling 6pence. However, on the present occasion, Police Sergeant Thomas heard from an adjoining room the promise of further good news for 2 shillings 6pence. At once took charge of the aged Professor of Palmistry. She was sent to prison for 14 days. I think you can start to get a sense of the pattern, the way of working. These fortune tellers were essentially knocking on the door, offering to tell the person their future. Sometimes there was the promise that they were about to come into a great sum of money or something like that. And if the person proved a little hesitant or dismissive, we see these tactics of playing on their fears and superstitions around ill-wishing and the evil eye in an attempt to lure them in. How did you first come across Beatrice's story, if you like, and what was the immediate thing that kind of drew you in?
As usual, I was researching something. I was researching a story about a con man from Gwenup, Paul Raby, who was another. Again, he also preyed on people's greed, and people believe what they want to believe. Completely different, a different landscape to Beatrice Small. He operated in the industrial areas with minings. He was a mining con man, another interesting guy. But I was scanning a report of Raby, and I was drawn to a case of fortune telling in Haverton Gifford, I think it was, and it was just a small little paragraph. And I looked at it and I just noted it because it might have been something interesting. And I noted the name Beatrice Small, and of course I'm on the British Newspaper Archive, which is a fantastic resource. I'm sure you know it well. And I just searched for Beatrice Small, and about 50 articles popped up, and you kind of sort them into order. But all these reports of her, and I'm thinking, yeah, okay, there's obviously something here. There's the obvious story of the crime, which you could always just put into a post. You could just do a simple list of crimes, list of activities, bang, that's a post, 5 minutes done. Or you could do it historically and look at the proper context, look at what was happening at the time, look at how she was able to operate, how she was able to move around, what else was happening, and that kind of context of the kind of the White Witch, the Pella, and how she was able to exploit that. It was purely by accident. I wasn't looking for fortune teller stories or a fortune teller post, but something caught my eye and got my interest, and I thought, and because there was a lot of material there, it wasn't just like one article and that's it, nothing else at all. She was obviously a prolific offender, and then there was quite a bit to work with in the archive. So it was nice. Yeah, it was a nice thing to write.
It's something that strikes me that I find really interesting is that, and I wonder if it's the sense that the authorities at the time, as well as the newspapers at the time, kind of seem to loop in. There's different words that you get, like Pella, Charmer, White Witch, Black Witch, and fortune tellers are kind of lumped in the mix in terms of labels that are attached to people associated with witchcraft. Do you think there was kind of a difference, or do you think that there was just a crossover and they were sort of regarded in the same way witches were?
I'm not sure. I'm not too sure about that. I think as Beatrice herself she was also a traveller, a gypsy. She was also a licensed hawker, and I think the 1824 Vagrancy Act kind of lumped all these various occupations that may hundreds of years ago have been separate. But I think with that act in 1824, the Vagrancy Act, it kind of lumped all these ancient, we'll call them an occupation, a way of making a living under one kind of remit, as not entirely honest. And since that point in history, it kind of filtered down that people who go from door to door selling goods are also trying to tell you fortune at the same time. They'll probably try anything to try and get some money out of you. But I think previous to that, I think no, it was a lot more separate. As to the journalists and the kind of the legalese at the time, I think they as well also kind of mulched all these ways of life together as well. And I think obviously, I mean, Beatrice Small, I think when she couldn't operate as a fortune teller, she would operate as something else. I mean, when she was in Plymouth, she was, as I said earlier, there was no recorded incidences of a fortune telling at all, and she realized that she couldn't do that. So she was probably a pure hawker at the time. But when she moved out into the countryside, she could kind of broaden her net and use other means of making money as well. So I think it was a kind of a two-way thing. I mean, I don't know. I'm thinking about Tammy Blee, the White Witch of Houston, and she purely was a Pella or a witch. But I think she may well have been the exception that proved the rule. I think because she was so well known and effective and famous that she had no real need to have any other way of making a living or having an income because she was so successful at what she did. Whereas I think they were living hand to mouth quite often, really, mainly because of the people she had to work on were generally speaking poor. and she could never make much money from them.
I'm not going to go into a lot of the specific court cases involving Beatrice Small, as I encourage you to check out Francis's article, which I'll pop a link to in the show notes. But it appears that in the spring of 1898, Beatrice seems to have been quite successful. She went on a bit of, well, what you might call a spree of fortune-telling in what became known as the Chancery Myths case. Beatrice is said to have gained £21 from the people of Lanreath and St Stephen's by Saltash, so she obviously managed to con quite a few people out of their money and their goods. As Francis has already mentioned, she had a very specific MO. There was this opener of telling people they had a lucky face, telling people their fortune through the cards. She would then tell them there was a great sum of money, often it was £600, just waiting for them to collect in Chancery. And Beatrice would be able to get the money for them in return for a fee. Now, word quickly reached the authorities, and they eventually managed to track her down in Jersey, where she seems to have been living with members of the Small family. At the trial, she pleaded guilty and was given 6 months with hard labour.
You've got a lucky face and all of those things. There's an element of that she maybe had some charisma, but there's also playing. I read in some instances a sense of people's fear, because having read a couple of examples in your article of where people have initially been a little bit reticent or hesitant, that she's kind of almost threatened this idea that she could ill wish them, if you like, if they don't kind of cough up.
I think she could turn ugly. I really do think that there was I think people would have accepted her as a fortune teller, maybe a peller, and she would have presented herself as such to these people. I think she was very adept at playing a part. She, as you say, she was obviously quite charismatic. She obviously had the chat, and she could obviously project this image. But at the same, and people would have known that as a white witch, or they imagined her to be a white witch, that she would have had some power, and as such, she would have demanded respect. And I think you're right. I think there was a little bit of trepidation as well, especially if you were a credulous, superstitious person. If you didn't give her at least some small token and send her on her way, that something ill would become you. I think when she was, I forget the village again. She operated in so many. She got a lot of money over a period of several days out of a servant in a home. When she was arrested in the street, the servant girl was obviously not a complete mug, and she told the police what was happening to her, and the police officer had actually hidden himself in the house to listen to what was going on as Beatrice Small was giving her all the tales. And as Beatrice Small left and walked down the street, she was arrested by this police officer, and she turned nasty, and she said, "Well, I'm going to ill wish this person. She will be flat on her back in bed for days." And it was interesting. I remember there was a story up in Leeds, a pretty horrible story, that there was a fortune teller and a man who was described as a wizard in Leeds in the 1850s, and he had been sent to prison for extorting money from a servant girl, and he had said, as he got sent down, that the devil will come to her in her bed, and sorry to say that he actually drove this poor girl insane. She was found to be taking the skin off her face and screaming, and she had to be confined in a straitjacket in an asylum. So with that, bearing all that in mind, she may well have been quite a scary person as well. I mean, I know she's probably pretty handy with her fists too. There's quite a few stories of her in Plymouth meeting with her relatives, and usually ended up in a pretty brutal fist fight. I think that when she got into a fight with two of her cousins in a pub, and one cousin, the newspaper report said, had actually lost both of her hands in an accident. And this lady said to Beatrice Small, "I'm going to give it to you with my stumps," which she did. So it must have been an absolutely horrific spectacle to behold. But yeah, yeah. When I read the report, I thought, really? That's absolutely insane. But yeah, she obviously knew how to play a role. She would knock on someone's door. Here she was, the massive shawl, the hat, the apron, all that kind of thing. You know, the rabbit's foot, etc., etc. We all know the stereotype, and that's how she would have appeared in a pub, hawking in the city. She probably looked completely different. She probably looked rather more humble, rather more polite. In a pub with a few drinks on board, she's probably someone completely different as well. Probably a foul-mouthed menace is probably what she was like. Pretty unpleasant person, if I'm being honest. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about this idea that you kind of mentioned of inciting the planets, because mention of the planet kind of gets mentioned on a few of those cases. I wonder what your thoughts were on that, and whether you had any idea how that fitted into the kind of fortune telling thing.
I think it was just something fantastical and otherworldly, just to make the mark think a little bit deeper about what they were getting into, and probably make them, well, A, impress them, and B, make them just to kind of, this person on my doorstep isn't a hawker with a pack of cards. She has the power of the sun and the moon at the same time. I think it was a kind of a theme that runs. So I mean, she probably used it every day on every door that she knocked on, probably.
Why do you think Beatrice Small's case is an important one to kind of be remembered? What do you think it kind of highlights, and why is it sort of, why do you consider it like a sort of important part of Cornwall and Devon history?
I think it's important because Cornwall in the 1880s and the 1890s, it wasn't just about the Tamar Bridge being built. It wasn't just about Truro becoming a city and Truro Cathedral opening. It was also a place where in 1865 in Portreath, a man could sacrifice a live calf, that rubbing a ring over a boil or a growth on your face would cure it. It was this kind of cultural melting pot. She obviously took this kind of romantic notion of fortune telling and reading cards and using spells and charms and all that kind of thing, and she kind of undercuts this whole notion of superstition and folklore by showing it for what it was. I mean, the more she got caught, the more people must have realised that believing in that way of life was on the way out, was kind of obsolete. Those kind of last final years, and I think that's why, and that's certainly what interested me about writing about her, and that's obviously what made her so newsworthy and so notorious at the same time.
That's it for this episode. A big thank you to Francis Edwards for taking the time to chat there about Beatrice Small and fortune tellers. I hope you've enjoyed it, and as always, if it's sparked any thoughts or ideas, then please feel free to get in touch. You can email me at thepiskietrap@gmail.com. You can also find me on Instagram and Facebook as The Piskie Trap. The Piskie Trap is produced and presented by me, Keith Wallace, with music by Elizabeth Westcott and artwork by Caris Harrington. We'll be back again very soon to explore a different topic, but for now, that's it from me. Thanks for listening.